Night falls, a little slower than usual, and the world seems to quiet down, just enough, for deeper thoughts to find their way in. Aquarius, you're used to keeping things within the reach of logic. You observe more, then you allow yourself to be carried away by emotion. And yet, lately, there's been something very subtle slipping into your quiet spaces. Not clear, no real explanation. Just a feeling. As if some kind of connection is still there, even though you've never quite named it. And what makes you pause isn't its intensity, but the way it feels. Real enough that you can't fully brush it aside. Someone. A thought. Or maybe a memory that never quite closed. Touching you gently, in a way that feels strangely personal. And if you lean into it just a little more, you might begin to notice. This didn't just start now. It may have been there, long before you ever realized it, in the middle of a day that feels almost identical to every other day. You slow down, just for a moment. Not because something big happened, nothing unusual, nothing worth pointing out. Just a very small moment, quietly letting you notice that something inside you has shifted. You're still working, still moving through the crowd, still surrounded by a space so familiar, everything seems to run on autopilot. And then, a passing thought. You don't know where it came from. It isn't tied to any clear image, but it carries a feeling, something distinctly its own, as if someone just brushed against your thoughts. Not with words, but with a kind of presence you can't quite name. You pause, not exactly to find an answer, just to feel what it actually is. Because as an Aquarius, things usually need a reason. Something that makes sense before they're allowed to stay in your mind. You're used to analyzing, used to questioning, used to understanding before you allow yourself to feel. And so, a feeling with no explanation stands out more than it should. Not because it's intense, but because it's different enough that you can't just dismiss it like you have before. Maybe it's just an old memory finding its way back. Maybe it's a face you haven't thought about in a long time. Or maybe it's simply the way your mind connects scattered pieces into a fleeting emotion. But what makes this moment stay isn't what it is. It's what it does to you. It slows you down. In a world that's always pushing forward, pausing to feel something so undefined isn't easy. And yet, you did. You didn't push it away. You didn't rush to explain it with logic. You just let it be there for a while, like standing by a window, looking out at the sky, not searching for anything, just realizing you're still here, still feeling, still connected to something deeper within you. And maybe the real value of this moment isn't whether someone is thinking about you or not. It's that you allowed yourself to feel something that can't be measured, something very subtle, but real enough to reach you. And sometimes it's in feelings like this where something begins, something your mind hasn't quite understood yet, but your heart has quietly known all along. You've learned to keep a certain distance from your emotions, not because you're cold, but because you understand the value of your inner freedom. You observe before you step in, yet you think before you allow yourself to feel. And in many ways, that's protected you from a lot of unnecessary complications. And yet, some connections don't follow that familiar pattern. They don't knock, they don't wait to be invited, they just appear very quietly. And still, somehow, clear enough for you to notice. This isn't something you fully control. There's no conversation happening. No message just came through. And yet, someone is there, in your thoughts, in a way that feels natural, not forced, not planned. Just a presence without words. And what makes it linger isn't how often you think about them, but how it feels when you do. A sense of familiarity, even when they're not there. A quiet closeness, without any clear definition. As if, between the two of you, there was something once, something that was never fully named, and somehow, that very thing still exists in an unseen space. Maybe they're feeling it too, not in the noise of a crowded moment, but in their own quiet spaces. When the day begins to settle, when nothing is left to distract the mind, that's when the most honest thoughts tend to surface. Unfiltered, unedited by logic. Just What remains after everything else fades. And if some image of you still lingers in moments like that, then maybe it isn't entirely by chance, not a certainty, not something that needs to become a story, just a gentle possibility that between you and someone else, there's still a thread of connection that never fully disappeared. No need to hold on tightly, no need to rush to let it go. It simply exists in its own way. And sometimes, it's just recognizing that is enough for you to understand. Not every connection needs words to hold meaning. And then, as you grow more comfortable letting things pass without needing to hold on, you begin to notice something different. Not everything needs a name in order to exist, just like not every feeling needs to be proven to hold meaning. Some things only appear in deeper spaces, where logic is no longer at the center of every decision. Aquarius, your sensitivity has always been unique, not the kind that's easy to see, but something quieter, a way of observing, of noticing the smallest details that others often miss. And that quiet awareness sometimes allows you to pick up on signals that were never spoken out loud. A glance that passed quickly, yet stayed with you longer than you expected. A conversation left unfinished, where both of you had something more to say. A moment that, if you could return to it, you might choose to stay a little longer. Things like that aren't always clear, but they have a way of staying with you, not as images, but as a feeling, like a song without lyrics. You don't remember the melody exactly, but somehow you recognize it the moment it plays again. And sometimes, it's the unfinished moments that carry a certain weight. Not because they were broken, but because they were never fully closed. There was no clear ending, so they don't disappear. They simply remain in a quiet corner of your mind. To you, it might seem like a small memory, but to someone else, it could mean something entirely different. Maybe they still remember the way you looked at them at a certain moment. The way you listened, without needing to say much. The way you showed up so naturally, and still left behind something they couldn't quite explain. And if something like that truly exists, then maybe you don't need to be certain. No need for confirmation, no need to search for proof. Because some connections, the more you try to define them, the more distant they become. They can only exist in their purest form, as a feeling, as a presence, something very subtle, but far from shallow. And maybe the value of these kinds of connections isn't in how long they last, but in the way they once touched you in a way not everyone can. A mark that doesn't need attention, but deep enough that even as time moves on, you still recognize you once connected with someone on a very different level. And then, after everything you've been feeling, maybe what matters most right now isn't finding a clear answer. There's no need to rush into belief, no need to convince yourself that this is right or wrong. Because Aquarius, in your own natural way, you need time to understand yourself first, before placing your trust in anything outside of you. You don't easily let emotions lead. You listen, but in a very quiet way. And maybe it's in that quiet where the most honest things begin to surface. So instead of asking whether someone is thinking about you, you might want to pause, just for a moment, and turn your attention inward. When you hear this, what do you feel? A soft sense of calm? Or a space inside you that feels like it's just been touched? A memory suddenly becoming clearer? Or simply a feeling you can't quite name? But strong enough to remind you you're not as unaffected as you once thought. And responses like these don't need to be explained right away. They don't need to become conclusions. They just need to be heard. Because sometimes, what's unfolding isn't really about someone else. It's about the way you reconnect with yourself. Some emotions don't arrive to lead you toward a person. They come to guide you back to deeper parts within. Parts you may have overlooked for a long time. And when you truly listen, without judgment, without rushing to define, you begin to notice something subtle, that not every feeling needs an answer. Sometimes, they just need a space safe enough to exist. And you are slowly becoming that space for yourself. A place where you can be honest with what you feel, even when it isn't fully clear. And maybe that is the most meaningful thing to hold on to in everything that's unfolding right now. And as you begin to listen to yourself a little more, you start to notice something very quiet. Not every connection in life needs a clear name to hold meaning. Some people pass through your life for only a short while, not long enough to become a full story, not defined enough to be called a relationship, and yet deep enough to leave something behind within you. Not a specific memory, not a clear image, just a feeling that feels uniquely yours, something you don't easily find again with anyone else. Aquarius, you don't tend to hold on to anything that feels shallow. You can let go quickly of what doesn't truly touch you, but once something truly settles, it stays. Not loudly, not something that takes over your thoughts every day, but it remains as something real within your journey. And what's interesting is, you may have become that same kind of presence in someone else's life, without trying to impress, without needing to be anything extraordinary by anyone else's standards, just by being yourself. The way you see the world, a little different, a little deeper, and sometimes hard to fully put into words. The way you show up in a conversation, not with too many words, but enough to make someone feel understood in a very natural way. There are things you do without even realizing their value, a look that carries sincerity, a way of listening without judgment, a way of being there for someone, without needing to fill every silence. And somehow, those are the things that reach deeper than anything carefully planned. Because people don't always remember what was clearly said. They remember how they felt when they were with someone. And if someone still thinks of you every now and then, in their own quiet moments, it may not be because you did something extraordinary, but because you made them feel something real, something not everyone can give. And maybe the value of remaining in someone's mind isn't about whether you ever realize it. It's about the fact that, at some point in their life, you were someone who made them pause and feel, a very subtle presence, but never without meaning. And then, after everything you've moved through in those quiet spaces, maybe you're no longer searching for answers the way you once did. Not because you suddenly understand everything, but because something within you has begun to understand in its own way. Yeah, you may not have said it out loud. You may not be ready to name this feeling, and yet, it no longer feels unfamiliar. It doesn't arrive as something new. It feels more like it has always been there. You just finally pause long enough to notice it. It isn't a big story. It isn't something that needs to change your life. Just a very subtle connection, but real enough that you can't simply call it coincidence. Like a thin thread, not holding you in place, not pulling you back, and still quietly existing somewhere between the two of you. No one speaks of it, no one confirms it, and maybe there's no need to. Because some things, when left in silence, feel more honest than any explanation could ever be. You don't need to go looking for that person. You don't need to return to what has already passed. Just a very small moment where you truly listen to yourself. No analyzing, no trying to figure it all out. Just being there with what you feel as it is. And in that quiet space, you might begin to notice something very gentle, that somewhere, at some point in their life, someone may have thought of you more than you ever realized. Not in a loud way, not in a way that's easy to see, but in a way that is deeply personal, quietly present, and real. And when you look back, you may also find, in some corner of your own mind, there is someone who still appears from time to time, not to disturb your world, but to remind you that you once felt something truly meaningful. No need to hold on, no need to let it go, just allowing it to exist as a quiet part of your journey. And maybe what's most beautiful isn't where that connection will go, but the way it once touched you, in a way you still remember, even when no one speaks of it. Something very subtle and still enough to stay.